Around 1650 BC, a team of scribes inscribed the following into law menis, and I'm reading this exactly as written. If a man lies with a horse or a mule menis, there is no offense. But if he lies with a dog menis, he shall die. Same category of act, different animal. Completely opposite legal outcome. A committee convened, deliberated, and agreed on this. Every civilization that ever rose left behind a law code. Some were visionary, some were brutal, and some reveal that ancient humans were solving very specific problems that no history class ever prepared you for. We're starting at the absolute beginning Sumer, roughly 2100 BC, home to the oldest surviving law code on Earth, which was somehow already unhinged and working our way toward those Hittite scribes to find out what else they had opinions about. Let's go. Welcome to Dumb Ages. So here's the thing you need to understand about the very first law code ever written down. You'd think the oldest surviving legal document on the planet would concern itself with the big stuff. Murder, theft, property. And it does. The Code of Ur-Nammu, carved in the city of Ur around 2100 to 2050 BCE, predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by roughly 300 years. 3 centuries. That's the gap between the first law code and the second one, and humanity used that entire head start to establish precedent. And one of the precedents they established was this. If a female slave compared herself favorably to her mistress Micus, if she looked at the woman who owned her and said, out loud, "Honestly, I think I'm doing it better, Micus," the punishment was that her mouth would be filled with a quart of salt. A quart of salt. This is one of the oldest written laws in human history, and it exists because at some point in ancient Sumer, someone got mouthy, and the legal system decided the appropriate response was seasoning. We are 0 for 1 on civilizations producing a normal legal system, and it only gets worse from here. Which brings us to Babylon, 300 years later, and the Code of Hammurabi. Now Hammurabi gets a good reputation. Eye for an eye, that's him. Sounds proportionate, sounds fair. Then you read Law Number 2, which sits right near the top of the code, meaning they considered it foundational. And here is what Law 2 actually covered. Accusations of sorcery. If someone accused you of witchcraft, this was the procedure. You went down to the river Minas and you leaped in. Yourself. If the river took you under and you drowned, that proved you were guilty, and your accuser got to keep your house. If you surfaced and swam to shore, that proved you were innocent, and your accuser was then executed for lying. Take a moment with that. The river was the judge. The river was the jury. The river was the sentence. Babylonian sorcery trials outsourced their entire legal reasoning to hydrology. Your fate depended not on evidence, not on witnesses, but on whether you were, physically, a strong swimmer. The best swimmers in ancient Babylon were presumably the hardest people in the world to convict of magic. And then there were the tavern laws. Oh, the tavern laws. If you wanted to run a bar in Babylon, understand that you were operating a capital offense minefield. Law 108. If a female tavern keeper accepted payment in money instead of grain at the correct weight, she was convicted and thrown into the water. Wrong currency drowning. Law 110. If a priestess so much as entered a wine shop for a single drink, she was burned to death. Not fined. Burned. And Law 109. My personal favorite, if conspirators met in your tavern to plot against the state, and you failed to capture them yourself and personally deliver them to the court, you were put to death. So as a Babylonian bartender, you were legally required to be a bouncer, an accountant, a theologian, and a counterintelligence agent, and any slip in any of those roles ended with you in the river. Also, Mina. And I want to be fair to Hammurabi here. If a builder built a house badly and it collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was executed. Reasonable. But Law 230 clarified, if the collapse killed the owner's son, then they executed the builder's son instead. The son. For his father's bad brickwork. Justice, but make it hereditary. Now cross into Egypt, because the Egyptians had the same instinct as Babylon Minas. When a case gets hard, hand it to an animal. In Egyptian belief, when you died, your heart was placed on a scale and weighed against a single feather, the feather of truth. Lighter than the feather, you passed on. Heavier Ninus, weighed down by your sins, Ninus, and a waiting monster with the head of a crocodile devoured your heart on the spot, and you simply ceased to exist. Babylon outsourced justice to a river, Egypt outsourced it to a scale and a reptile. And in life, the Egyptians extended that reverence to a specific animal, the cat. Killing a cat in ancient Egypt, even by accident, was treated as a capital offense. There is a documented case of a Roman soldier who killed a cat, reportedly without meaning to, and was set upon by a furious Egyptian mob and torn apart in the street. And the authorities did essentially nothing about it, because as far as they were concerned, he'd had it coming. An entire legal culture where you could get away with a great deal, but not with startling a cat. Now we go to Athens, 621 BC, and a man named Draco. You have heard his name and didn't know it, because we still describe brutally harsh rules as draconian, and that word is his legacy, and he earned it. Draco was asked to write down Athens' laws, and his solution to nearly every crime was the death penalty. Petty theft, death. Idleness, death. Stealing a cabbage or a single piece of fruit, death. When people asked Draco why such trivial offenses deserved execution, he reportedly answered that he considered these lesser crimes to deserve it, and he simply had no greater punishment available for the more important ones. He wanted a harsher penalty for murder. He couldn't find one. He'd used it all up on the produce. The Athenian orator Demades later said that Draco's laws were written not in ink, but in blood. And the Athenians agreed. In 594 BCE, the reformer Solon repealed essentially the entire code for being intolerably cruel. The only piece he kept the single clause worth preserving out of the whole bloody thing was the law on homicide. Everything else, including death for cabbage, went in the bin. It took the Athenians about 27 years to look at their own legal system and go, you know what? Maybe not the fruit one. Sparta, next. And Sparta had a different philosophy, which was, what if crime was the curriculum? Under the agoge, the brutal state training system for Spartan boys, children were legally required to steal. Specifically, boys were sent to steal cheese from the altar of Artemis Orthia as an exercise in stealth. And here's the twist that tells you everything about Sparta. The crime was not stealing. Stealing was the assignment. The crime, the thing you were punished for meanness, was getting caught. Boys who were caught in the act were publicly whipped, sometimes savagely, not because they'd taken the cheese, but because they'd been bad at taking the cheese. Sparta raised an entire society on the principle that the only real sin is incompetence. Sparta also had opinions about money, courtesy of their semi-legendary lawgiver Lycurgus Deaning, and I say semi-legendary because historians aren't fully convinced the man existed, or that this reform happened the way the stories say. But the story goes, he banned gold and silver outright. In their place, citizens were forced to use currency made of iron bars, heavy, bulky spits of metal, so cumbersome that moving any real sum of money reportedly required a team of oxen to haul it. The entire point was to make wealth so physically annoying to accumulate and hide that nobody would bother. You could not discreetly pocket a bribe when your life savings needed livestock to transport. And to keep young Spartans off alcohol, the state used the enslaved helots as a live demonstration, periodically forcing them to get publicly, staggeringly drunk and perform degrading, stumbling dances so that Spartan youth could watch and be disgusted into sobriety. Sparta invented the world's first anti-drinking commercial, and it was a real human being. Then there's Rome, which liked to imagine itself as the birthplace of orderly law, and technically it was, with the 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code. And buried in that foundation is this. A Roman father held near total power over his children, so the law had to specify the limits, and the limit it landed on was, if a father sold his son into slavery 3 times, then, and only then, the son was free of him. Read that again. 3 times. Rome looked at fatherhood and installed a 3-strike system. which means the framers of the 12 tables genuinely sat down and decided that selling your own son once was a mistake anyone could make, twice was unfortunate, but three times was really more of a pattern. And on debt, the same code allowed that a defaulting debtor could be cut into pieces by his creditors, divided by however much each was owed, and it added, helpfully, that if they cut off more or less than their fair share, it should not be counted a crime. Rome, thoughtfully waiving the penalty for rounding errors during a dismemberment. Now let's go to China, because China ran this experiment across several dynasties and produced a greatest hits album. Start with the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCC, the dynasty that unified China and built the terracotta army. We know their laws in detail, because in 1975, archaeologists in Hubei province dug up bamboo slips inscribed with the actual legal code. And on those slips is this: a grown man caught shedding tears in public had his beard and his eyebrows shaved off. The Qin cult of martial toughness classified male crying as a punishable act of weakness, so if you wept, the state removed your facial hair. You cried, and they left with your eyebrows. The same bamboo slips reveal that legal adulthood in Qin was determined not by age, but by height. Men under 1.5 meters and women under 1.43 meters could not be convicted of a crime. So Qin justice had a loophole, and the loophole was, be short. A 40-year-old under 5 feet was legally a child who could get away with anything. Then there's the Tang dynasty, centuries later, and the carp. The word for carp in Chinese, Li, sounded exactly like the surname of the Tang imperial family, Li. And the emperors could not tolerate their sacred names swimming around in ponds getting eaten. So it became law. If you caught a carp, you were required to release it. If you were caught selling a carp, the penalty was 60 lashes. And the fish itself could not simply be called a carp, it had to be addressed, respectfully, as Lord Red Carp. An empire of tens of millions of people passed a law protecting the dignity of a fish because it was an accidental homophone. 2 dynasties, 1 message, our rules are extremely specific, and one of them is about a fish's feelings. Which takes us across the ocean to the Aztec Empire, the Mexica, and their approach to alcohol, which is genuinely one of the most thoughtful pieces of legislation on this entire list in the most horrifying way. Public drunkenness in the Aztec world was a capital offense. If you were caught intoxicated in the street, that could be the end of you. Unless, and this is the exception that makes it beautiful, unless you had reached the age of 70 and raised a family. Once you hit 70, having done your duty to society, you were legally permitted to get as thoroughly, completely obliterated as you wished. You earned it. And the state did not just permit this. The state supported it. Elderly citizens on a bender were assigned children, young family members, to escort them safely home afterward. The Aztec Empire had a designated walker program for drunk grandparents. That is a functioning civilization. That is genuinely more compassionate than most modern policy. The Aztecs were, however, less gentle with the young. Under the law recorded in the Codex Mendoza, children 12 and older could be punished by being held over a fire of burning chili peppers, forced to inhale the smoke. Children under 10 usually got off with a warning for minor offenses, though a parent might threaten them with the spines of a maguey cactus. An Aztec adultery law was pointedly lopsided. A married man was only executed for adultery if his partner was also married, while a married woman was guilty regardless of whether her lover was single or not. The math was not applied evenly, which, historically, tracks. And now we come back to where we started. The Hittites, in Anatolia, roughly 1650 to 1180, beset the civilization whose lawyers opened this whole thing. Because I gave you the beginning of the horse clause, but not the full reasoning, and the full reasoning is the finest piece of legal hair-splitting in the ancient world. Here is the actual system. Under Hittite law, clause 199, if a man had relations with a pig or a dog, it was a capital offense. The man was put to death. And the animal was also executed because the Hittites considered the animal an equal participant, a co-defendant, fully culpable, and it died alongside him. But under clause 200a, if a man did the exact same thing with a horse or a mule, The law states plainly, there is no offense, no crime, no penalty. Except, and here comes the lawyer, except that he may never again approach the king, and he may never become a priest. So sit with the deliberation that produced this. A room full of Hittite legal scholars sat down and worked out a full zoological hierarchy of sin. Dog or pig, death for you, death for the animal, case closed. Horse or mule, technically fine, no one dies, but you are permanently barred from politics and the clergy. They drew a precise line on one side, execution, on the other side, a career limitation mine of negatives, and the line ran straight down the middle of the animal kingdom. Somebody, on some afternoon over 3,000 years ago, argued that a horse was legally distinct from a dog in this specific context, and won, and it became statute. That is not a law that gets written by accident. That is a law that took a lawyer. So what did we actually learn walking through 4,000 years of legislation? That the very first law ever written was about salt in someone's mouth. That an empire once appointed a river as its sorcery court, and another weighed your soul against a feather. That you could be executed for a cabbage, torn apart for a cat, whipped for being bad at theft, shaved for crying, lashed for insulting a fish, escorted home for being a drunk grandfather, and disqualified from the priesthood over a mule, but not a horse. Every one of these was real. Every one was carved or written by people who believed they were bringing order to chaos. And the great comforting lie of history is that our ancestors were wiser than us. They were not wiser. They were exactly like us, just with fewer tools and far more confidence. If you enjoyed this trip through the fine print of the ancient world, stick around Dumb Ages Minus, because history's dumbest paperwork is a bottomless well. And we are only just getting started.